If everybody's ready, I think by the Antiquary's clock, we're just past 5. So welcome everybody to our first meeting of 2025. We gather together in unprecedented times. As everybody knows, I'm sure, we lost our beloved president of over 20 years just over a week ago. John would have wanted this event to go ahead, very much so. He would not have wanted it to be cancelled. But under the circumstances, we have postponed the 12th night party. But we will have the chance after the lecture to join together for a drink so we can share memories of John and grieve together. So given that this is unprecedented, there'll be a little bit of a running order here, so please forgive me before we introduce the lecture. At the end of the lecture, after questions and the normal end of lecture, we will stay seated, and Martin Hennig has very kindly offered to lead us in a minute's silence. So if everybody will stay in the lecture theatre before we go out for drinks. So stay for a minute's silence, then we will go out for drinks. Richard Plant, who is extraordinarily generously standing up as acting secretary until we are able to make new arrangements for a secretary, will propose a toast to John. So there are drinks for everybody, please stay. There is also a condolences book, which I will move into the meeting room. This is for Anna, John's widow, and Freddie, his son. Please, if you could sign that as a memorial to him. There will be plenty of other opportunities to commemorate John, and we're, as a council, working together to think about the best ways in which we can do that, to commemorate his huge achievements. But this isn't the moment for a eulogy, and I'm not the person to lead it. So I will now move on to the next business of the meeting, which is to introduce our lecturer, who really needs no introduction to us. Nikki is one of our former presidents, Nikki Coldstream, hugely eminent in the field of late medieval architecture. Her books on medieval masons and on the decorated style are really fundamental to the topic. I've discussed with her, and she doesn't mind my saying that she is always both thought-provoking and deliberately provocative, and she assures me that she's going to keep up that record. So we're all looking forward to hearing what she has to say on this fascinating topic, crowdfunding in the architectural patronage of late medieval English merchants. So thank you very much, Nikki.
Good evening, everybody. I hope you will forgive me if I start with just a few words about John, because as a former president, I have such memories of arriving, being elected, and being terrified immediately and extremely ignorant. And John was wise, supportive, generous, and kind, just leading me into how you actually are a president. And without him, life would have been very much more difficult. And so I personally owe him a huge debt of gratitude for his efficiency and his just being there, and always a rock, an absolute rock he was. And when I thought about dedicating this lecture to John's memory, I was a little bit worried because I thought this is outside his comfort zone. He's a Romanesque man. And this is mostly 15th century. And then Martin Hennig reminded me that he was a polymath, and which is perfectly true. And then I remembered that several years ago, I walked into Long Melford Church, and there at the far end of the nave was John taking a group of innocents, I would say, round the churches of East Anglia. And I listened, just as they were listening, spellbound to John, weaving his magic, explaining the church to them. And of course, he was wonderful. And I realized that actually that is a segue into what I'm going to talk about this evening. So it's not too inappropriate, I don't think. So, crowdfunding. From at least the 14th century, merchants formed the economic backbone of this country. And yet, although there's been considerable coverage of their activities in such great port cities as London, Norwich, York, and Bristol, their architectural patronage has in general at best been taken for granted and fundamentally overlooked, except for specific instances. And since building requires a lot of money, merchants' sheer financial clout ought to have alerted us to examine this aspect more closely. And when you realize that merchants were responsible for every type of building except castles, it becomes obvious that what they built is both part of the architectural history of their time and tells us a great deal about merchants as a social class. There are a number of reasons for this comparative neglect, and more probably than I'm about to suggest. The first may be the difficulty of defining a merchant, which to some people is even more problematic than defining a woman or a working person. Clive Burgess adopted Hamilton Thompson's view of them as those who trade in goods and were not, like craftsmen and artisans, responsible for their manufacture. But that doesn't quite do, since while it may describe urban traders in imported goods, it does not take account of people in small towns and the countryside who were both makers and retailers. Clothiers, for example, who both made and sold cloth, and masons, after all, who leased quarries and both quarried the stone for their own purposes and to sell it on to other people. So I am being very reductive and taking a merchant as somebody who engaged in trade. Then, despite what I said just now, there is the difficulty of defining merchants as a social class. Knights or gentlemen were defined by income and to some extent by birth, but this didn't and doesn't work for merchants. Gabriel Byng, in his Church Building and Society in the late Middle Ages, elides them quite often with the gentry. And some defined themselves as gentry. John Tame of Fairford did so, for example, in the same sentence that he identified himself as a merchant. But while some merchants certainly behaved like gentry, and indeed were actually born members of the gentry who took to trade, many others did not. And Byng is not the only modern scholar who kind of subsumes them in the gentry label. In practice, the class boundaries were increasingly permeable, so that in the course of his career, a merchant could rise from being a small trader to gentry status, and moving further into knighthood or even the aristocracy. Oh, sorry, yes, here is Dirk, famous Dirk. Now this, yes. The de la Pole family, who are admittedly an extreme case, rose within 3 generations from trading fish in Hull to becoming the Dukes of Suffolk. Chaucer's granddaughter Alice, herself the great-granddaughter of a merchant, was the first Duchess of Suffolk. God's House, the church and almshouses that are her memorial at Ewelme in Oxfordshire, published by John Goodall, if you remember, is far removed in every sense from her wine merchant great-grandfather's domicile in the London Vintry. The de la Poles brings to another phenomenon which seems to have worked against merchants throughout history, and that is snobbery. Even now, there's a taint of trade, long a middle-class anxiety, of course, which is still detectable in quite recent studies. It goes back at least to Chaucer, a vintner's son, who mocked the difference between appearance and reality in his introduction to the merchant in the Canterbury Tales. And as the de la Poles rose to prominence, contemporaries teased them for their origins. This taint is often elided with contempt for the riches of self-made men. In modern studies, we detect a moralizing tendency over which the words camel and needle's eye tend to hover. When did you last, any of you, see a reference to a merchant that wasn't prefaced by the word wealthy, loaded with pejorative implications? But architecture is impossible without wealth. And in the context of patronage, no one blames royal, aristocratic, or ecclesiastical builders for being rich. Though it does occur to me that actually Barbara Abu al-Hajj did blame the bishops of Chartres for building the cathedral on the backs of their slaves in the wheat fields of the countryside. But I can't think off the top of my head of anybody else who does it quite as vehemently as she did. Nor, it seems, do they blame aristocrats for engaging in trade. John Howard, the first Duke of Norfolk, a Yorkist ally who was killed at Bosworth, and ancestor of both Anne Boleyn and Queen Catherine Howard, was a ship owner, and although he did not trade directly, he transported goods for those who did. Now, luckily, many historians now find merchants interesting, and economic historians have been joined by others in searching parish records, criminal records, wills, and the documentary sources that begin to abound from the mid-14th century to reconstruct merchants' lives and their activities. And out of this has come much background material that is useful for the study of both buildings and patronage, with closer scrutiny of both. And there's enough now to enable us to try to bring merchants into sharper focus as builders. Yet the focus remains blurred, because much evidence of their patronage is as elusive as their place in the social hierarchy. It's bitty, a porch here, a tower there, a window somewhere else. Or else their efforts have disappeared inside later rebuildings of houses and warehouses. What remains seems so much less than the historical record attests. From the 14th century, this is really when the merchants emerge in the records, and we see them as commercial dealers, civic dignitaries, supporters of their guilds. Their networks are astonishing, not only among fellow guild or liverymen in a town or city, but over long distances as they moved between trading outlets, many of them keeping a strong bond, if they were London merchants, with their place of origin. My talk this evening, sorry, I'll show you. That's two who, yes, my talk this evening is confined to parish churches. But in addition to them, merchants built chapels, almshouses, hospitals, schools, warehouses, country houses, and townhouses. They also attended to town walls and gates, prisons, bridges, and conduits. The kinds of building changed over time, with almshouses and schools, for example, really appearing in the 15th century and the 16th. But their building activity, commercial and pious, was copious. This list demonstrates that the earthly kingdom was as important to a merchant as the kingdom of God. And George Monarchs, who was Lord Mayor of London in 1515, built a chapel in Walthamstow Church, but at the same time, he was building a bridge and 2 causeways across the marshes to help both him and his neighbours. Merchants' wills and memorials show similar careful provision for the earthly and the heavenly future. A characteristic mercantile will provided generously for his family, contributed towards the repair of roads and bridges, and left money for a tomb, a chantry chapel, or part of a church building. This mesh of altruism and self-interest perfectly reflects the words that Francesco d'Artini, the 14th century merchant of Prato, wrote in his ledgers, "In the name of God and of profit." The big cities, London, York, Norwich, Bristol, give us evidence of the collective patronage of civic projects, of financing by livery companies or groups of merchants. But we do have to be very careful of this evidence. Too much reliance on the earliest antiquaries, William Worcester, John Leyland, and John Stowe, has distorted the picture. Leyland, in particular, is as reliable only as far as the information he was given. And when his attributions can be checked against independent evidence, they're not always accurate. Owing to Leyland and Stowe's taste for promoting the individual whenever possible, some buildings are associated with a single name, likely to be that of the most substantial contributor, rather than who was not necessarily the sole patron. For example, the Leadenhall Market in London is attributed to Simon Eyre, draper and mayor, but although he had made a lot of money, he was not solely responsible for it. Nor can we be entirely certain that Hugh Clopton built the bridge at Stratford on Avon without help, although tradition attributes it to him. and Clopton was certainly a large benefactor to Stratford. The builder of New Place, the house later owned by Shakespeare, he also paid for the nave of the Guild Chapel of the Holy Cross. Which brings us a little nearer to the main topic of my talk. Clopton, for all his wealth, did not pay for the whole chapel. One striking aspect of merchant patronage is how few of them did build complete churches. In London in the 15th century, Richard Whittington, a very rich man, financier to successive kings and a big benefactor to the city both in life and in the afterlife, built St. Michael Paternoster in his home parish of St. Michael Paternoster Royal as his burial church, and that of his wife, who predeceased him by several years. And Whittington's contemporary Thomas Knowles rebuilt St. Anthony's Church in the city, though possibly together with his son. Sir Nicholas Twyford, Lord Mayor in 1388, and his wife Dame Marjorie built St. John Zachary. The wording in Stowe's Survey of London is ambiguous, but it implies that the money was hers, actually. Stowe attributes St. Michael Crooked Lane to John Lovekin, stockfishmonger and mayor in 1358, and St. Swithin to John Hind, draper and mayor in 1405. These buildings, including St. Michael Paternoster, were small, on cramped sites, being in the City of London where there was no room for anything. But their builders, another reason is their buildings were also concerned with tombs and embellishments, as well as their other secular architectural ventures. In almost every other instance, it appears that a church building was the work of several merchants, acting either simultaneously or over several years, or if not generations. Outside London, sole patrons of ecclesiastical buildings are very rare. The small chapel at Rycote, near Tame in Oxfordshire, was built by the city fishmonger Richard Quatermains, who was also a gent, incidentally, as his house chapel. It's about, 100 yards from the house, but he was entombed in his own chantry chapel in Tame Church. And yet, while John Barton has long been alleged to have been the builder of the church at Holme by Newark, Gabriel Byng refutes this, and the evidence of the fabric suggests that Barton was responsible only for the south chapel that he actually mentions in his will. I think I can use the cursor here. Yes, I can. This is the south chapel. There's his tomb between the south chapel and the chancel. Here is the chancel. Here is the chancel, and here is the south chapel, and there is a very obvious break, really very obvious break. And the chancel was refenestrated at some later moment, and is probably 13th century. The greater and lesser towns of the kingdom betray the same pattern of merchant activity. Merchants, and often parishioners who were not merchants, collectively building and furnishing their churches while not neglecting their houses and business premises and their duty to the wider community. And we will now home in on 3 examples of parish churches known or thought to be funded by merchants and what that meant in practice. I'm not generalizing from these, I'm merely picking 3 examples. These churches provide no evidence of the fundraising and committees discussed by Byng and show that there were many ways of achieving the final outcome. They are Steeple Ashton in Wiltshire, St. Thomas in Salisbury, and Fairford in Gloucestershire. Their written sources vary from a reworked inscription at Steeple Ashton to the contract at Salisbury and one single reference in a will at Fairford. Steeple Ashton and Salisbury were certainly crowd-funded, and I shall argue the same for Fairford. A byproduct of the investigation is the light that it throws on the implications that crowdfunding and the length of time it took to build even a parish church had for the stability of the church design, and what that may tell us about late medieval masoncraft and the design process. St. Mary's Steeple Ashton represents a declaration of local wealth built on metaphorical sand. Steeple Ashton lies north of Salisbury Plain, not very far from Eddington, actually. And it forms a triangle with the cloth towns of Bradford-on-Avon and Trowbridge. Leyland, visiting in 1542, saw a pleasant little market town, largely dependent on the cloth industry, with attractive buildings, including a very fine church built within living memory. This is a bit of a trope with Leyland. It's a phrase he often used, and in this instance, it was correct. The church commands the view for miles, and in Leyland's day, the late 15th century West Tower, which is the oldest part of the building, the existing building, supported a wooden spire, which brought the total height to 186 feet, which, for those, if there's anybody in the room who hasn't yet qualified for the vote, that's 15.5 metres. Right. The spire fell in 1670, but even without it, the building looks intentionally dominant. Its profile bulked out with pinnacles and would-be flying buttresses. Yet all was illusion. The existing church can never have been anything but a white elephant. Leyland recorded that the aisles had been paid for by two clothiers, Walter Lucas and Robert Long. He always liked to attribute buildings to individual patrons, and such a picture of mercantile generosity fitted his presentation of England as a land of modestly prosperous trading communities. Cloth making, however, needs a good water supply, in which Steeple Ashton was deficient. It was surrounded by good grazing land, much used by woolmen from Trowbridge. Walter Lucas and Robert Long were active around 1500, but there's no evidence of cloth making before their day, and not much more for the 16th century. Robert Long's sons moved to Trowbridge, and Walter Lucas had to lure his son back from Bradford-on-Avon with a bequest of household goods. And it looks as if the two clothiers took a gamble on Steeple Ashton and lost. But in the meantime, they launched a magnificent rebuilding of the church, and the history of which is more complicated than Leyland cared to record. He relied on an inscription board at the west end of the church, which was refreshed in Victorian times, and says the north aisle was rebuilt at the cost and charge of Robert Long and Edith, his wife. And the south aisle, for the most part, was built at the cost and charge of Walter Lucas and Matilda, his wife. It went on to say that the rest of the church, with the steeple, was built at the cost and charge of the parishioners then living. The authenticity of this last bit is open to question, but the general narrative is quite evident in the fabric, as we shall see. Gabriel Byng rightly draws attention to the words "for the most part," and both he and the Victoria County history reveal a sad story of delays, inadequate funds, and cost-cutting. Walter Lucas died in 1495, and no one even pretends that he finished the south aisle. Robert Long died in 1501, and his will asked that the north side of the church be completed at his expense. Before he died, he had entered into an agreement with a mason, Thomas Lovell of Trowbridge, to do £80 worth of work on the church. But when Lovell died, £49 was still owing to him. Edith, Robert Long's widow, was either reluctant or unable to continue the work, and it was not until 1508 that her second husband, William Morgan, ordered it to be completed. In other words, not enough money and delays. What is remarkable, however, is the consistency of the design of the two aisles and how they and the elevation of the main vessel were brought to completion over a longish period. There are 4 bays between the tower and the chancel arch. The chancel is now 19th century. And the aisles are mirror images of each other. Each bay has a magnificent Leon vault set on quite conoidal springers with spaced ribs that hint at fans before forming a square on a flat surface with foliate bosses and large keystones, carved in a dry, rather inflexible but impressive style that's reflected in the splendid corbels on the wall niches. The piers are consistent throughout, with groups of capitals interspersed with continuous mouldings. Capitals and bases alike are elegantly moulded, the base is polygonal and bell-like on high plinths. As in many buildings, with aisles attributed to single patrons, it does pose the question where the aisle ends and the main vessel begins. Did Lucas and Long indent to build the piers up to the capital level and no further? That the design from wall to wall and floor to clerestory was conceived as a whole and completed as such is obvious from the enmeshing of pier profiles, wall shafts, setbacks of the upper story, and continuous clean cutting, with no sign of hesitation or deviation, but plenty of repetition. It is a through design, each element integral to the whole. The break comes at the top of the vault, here, in fact. At least the top of the vault springers, where stone becomes plaster and wood. It's a splendid vault, but it's not what was originally planned. And judging by the incomplete flyers over the aisles, the decision to abandon a stone vault was taken when the parishioners took over the cost. If you think these are flyers, but they're not, because there's no arch there, there's the piers, and there's a complete gap. They just didn't build them. But at what stage did they take over the costs? Presumably before the superstructure of the nave was built. Unfortunately, the absence of documents means that all we can confidently assert is that the quality and consistency of this building indicates that someone was in overall charge for at least a generation. And I'm very happy to report that this really wonderful building the parish is a very rich one. I'll leave you with that thought. At Steeple Ashton, then, we have merchants who started out with ambition and couldn't meet the cost. So crowdfunding had to come to the rescue of their widows. And in defense of the widows, they may well have been left with children to bring up, and reasonably decided that rather than let the children starve, saving one's soul through architecture was best left to the men. Now, St. Thomas's at Salisbury presents a different crowdfunding picture. Here we're dealing with the partial rebuilding of existing fabric rather than a project launched from scratch. The works have been studied and published by Tim Tatton Brown, and they make extraordinary reading. St. Thomas's, which is much more famous for the doom painting over the chancel arch, was one of the main town churches of Salisbury, and it was looked upon by the Salisbury merchants as theirs, since in practice they were excluded from the spiritual benefits conferred by the cathedral. But the rector was the dean and chapter, who nevertheless expected the parishioners to pay all the upkeep. Until 1447, that is, when the chancel and part of the south chapel collapsed. And the following year, the parishioners entered into an agreement with the dean and chapter to rebuild the chancel, lengthening it eastwards by 20 feet. The dean and chapter agreed to rebuild the pillars, the arches, and the lead roof, while the parishioners would pay for the clerestory. So far, so good, and the measurements supplied show that the rector was willing to pay only for the restitution of what had collapsed. The dean and chapter made themselves responsible for the north side, the parishioners for the south, and the latter were obliged to pay for the extra 20 feet, the roofs of the north and south chapels, and look after everything in perpetuity. 12 parishioners signed the agreement with the dean and chapter, most of them former mayors or guild leaders. And both sides agreed to make the work match one another, and indeed the effect in the chancel is entirely continuous. The new work rather slams into the east end of the nave, revealing a fragment of its predecessor. The chancel elevation of arcade and clerestory pushes the latter right up among the roof timbers, leaving an expanse of plain wall that in its present state looks austere. The piers are of the standard quatrefoil type with hollow mouldings separating the four half shafts, and foliage capitals lead to two orders of moulded arches. The two parties to the agreement stuck generally to their brief, but on the south side, the merchants began to assert themselves. The capitals of the south arcade bear small shields where their merchants' marks could be inscribed or painted. And the second capital from the west has an inscription entwined among the foliage that declares that John Nichol and his wife Jane founded the pillar and part of the arch, my italics. The capitals further east have the initials and marks of two town mayors, William Lightfoot, a signatory to the agreement, and John Wyatt, who had been mayor in 1447. One of them, a tailor, William Swain, who was to be 3 times mayor, rebuilt and lengthened the South Chapel, which had apparently been rebuilt before. At any rate, provision for rebuilding had been made because the Marriott family left money for this in 1410. Since the South Chapel links through to the main vessel, and the arcade and capitals were paid for by the other merchants, Swain's work in it must have been confined to the outer walls and the roof. You see, here's this aisle problem. If you rebuild an aisle, how much are you actually rebuilding? Tim Tatton-Brown notes the break at the east end of the chapel, which indeed runs along the whole of the east end, including the north chapel. Tim evidently managed to scrabble about inside at the east end. My heart failed me because there were altar rails and a good deal of stuff, and it's very difficult to see it in the inside, but on the exterior you can see the changes in plinth level quite easily. The North Chapel had been commandeered by local non-merchant families, Godmanstons and Hungerfords, who paid for its lengthening. The roof was given by William Ludlow of Hill Deverill, a rich royal servant, with the post of butler from Henry IV to Henry VI. We might compare St. John's, Cirencester, a parish church similarly dominated by the local ecclesiastics, in that case, Cirencester Abbey, where the merchants were scarcely allowed a look in before the 16th century. But senior servants of the York family, they were huge York holdings around that part of the world, the senior servants of the York family were allowed to found the Chantry Chapel of the Holy Trinity on the north side of the nave in the mid-15th century. As at Salisbury, when the nave was rebuilt in 1510, the merchants added the coats of arms of themselves and other distinguished families of Cirencester. My third and last example presents a different problem. A church that allegedly had a single patron, whose identity has become fixed in both the scholarly and the popular mind. Crowdfunding for this building is denied by almost everyone because they won't, even doesn't cross their minds. That's why it's denied. So it's not exactly denied, it just doesn't occur to them. Only one document gives us a real clue to its possible date. We have no evidence of recalcitrant widows or contributors of half an arch. What we do have is an effectively undocumented stone framework that supports a spectacular array of early 16th century stained glass, and I refer to St Mary's, Fairford in Gloucestershire. The Fairford glass is magnificent, and its survival defies belief, but survive it did, with only minimal damage, and a recent cleaning and repair by Barley Studios has not only brought it back to life, but has thrown up new evidence about how it was made and the possible influences on the date and design. Now, one of my difficulties in talking or writing about Fairford is that since no one is interested in the architecture, almost all the discussion of the patron it's included in discussion of the glass or his tomb or in liturgical fittings such as screens. Now, I, on the other hand, am interested in the architecture, not least because it came first. No building, no glass. And besides being quite unqualified to talk about the glass, I'm let off the hook because the patron of the architecture, who is so much talked up, actually died before the glass was installed. So I have the great question, I don't even need to think, well, I do have to think about it, but I don't need to think about it out loud. And the great question for us, though, is how many people were involved in paying for the structural framework? The patron in question is John Tame of Fairford, who I mentioned earlier, a successful sheep farmer and wool merchant. His link to the architecture is significant for architectural history because his tomb lies in the church in the place that he specified in his will, drawn up in 1497, namely the North Chapel, later turned into a Lady Chapel, just west of the chancel. It's in fact the patron's spot. In the event, John Tame lived until 1500. This clause in his will is the only contemporary evidence we have of when the church may have been built. John Tame lived until 1500 in the event, which that's interesting in itself, because he must have recovered. Normally they made their wills when they were on their deathbeds, but he lived another 3 years, and I suspect his son and heir probably put a pillow over his face eventually. This clause in his will, he bequested liturgical vessels and so on attest to John Tame's continued association with it, but he didn't leave anything towards the building costs. And his son and heir, Edmund, who was knighted by Henry VIII, did much to promote the family's social standing after his father's death, installing the newly acquired family coat of arms in the north chapel and south porch. But this did not involve the father. Leyland was told and faithfully reported that the church was begun by John and finished by Edmund, and that the Tames, wealthy within a single generation, had revived the fortunes of Fairford. In fact, they weren't wealthy within a single generation, and Fairford was flourishing before they ever got there. Leyland visited Fairford in 1542 on the same itinerary as his Steeple Ashton visit, and by which time both John Tame and Sir Edmund were dead, and the heir, another Edmund, was living elsewhere. There was no painted board in the church, and Leyland's named informant has actually been misidentified. He was called Ferrers, but everybody's got the wrong Ferrers, in my view. It's another Ferrers. Now, why should this matter? It matters because Fairford is a big church. It's far bigger than the east end of St Thomas's at Salisbury, or the nave of Steeple Ashton. It used up a large quantity of best quality oolitic limestone from the famous Cotswold quarries. This was an expensive building, and its cost has been attributed to one man with the help of his son. And if we knew exactly when the church was built, it would certainly help us, because antiquarian rumour also has John Tame, who acquired joint lordship of the manor of Fairford in 1479, building a large house running from somewhere southwest of the church to the town bridge over the River Colne, which gives enough space for a large range. They also allege an older existing house north of the church, and it's very confusing to try and disentangle all that, but I suspect that that was the church that he was enlarging. And if he was rebuilding the parish church and simultaneously giving himself an enormous house, he must have been very rich indeed and operating at a different level from the great city merchants I've already mentioned. John Barton of Home also built a house. It is the sheep have paid for all, gentlemen. But as we've seen, he did not build the church. Richard Quatermains at Rykert built both house and church, but the church is tiny. So how can John Tame have found the money for Fairford Church? Now, I've written a study of the historiography of John Tame, which is coming out in the next volume of our journal. So I will not here bore you with all the intricate arguments that I have very obligingly disentangled for you in that piece. But suffice it to say here that the early antiquaries, Leyland and Anthony Wood, passed on some material that was seized on by the local genealogists of the 18th century. I feel dreadful saying this in the lecture room of the Society of Antiquaries in front of a whole lot of fellows of the Society of Antiquaries, but the truth was that 18th century antiquaries are not always reliable. These gentlemen introduced a degree of muddle that has never gone away. And since the mid-19th century, it has been built on to create a John Tame who is unrecognizable from the existing contemporary record. A man with international connections, a merchant of the Company of the Staple, which means he was a real biggie in city terms. Someone, therefore, whose wealth was worthy of the church he allegedly built. Most of this is invention, repeated in successive publications until it becomes an illusory truth, a factoid. Repeat something often enough and it becomes fact. The instinct seems to be that the Tames must have been stupendously rich because they built this church, which seems to me to be approaching the problem from the wrong end. The documentary history of John Tame, which is the sole evidence we have, points only one way, to a competent and successful wool merchant, buying land, breeding sheep, selling his wool, occasionally bending the rules as they all did, marrying into a well-connected family, and above all, a man who thought and acted locally. It does not scream larger simultaneous architectural projects, and I find it inconceivable that such a man should be doing what far wealthier city merchants did not. So what, apart from wishful thinking, is going on? Until sometime in the late 15th century, oh, I'm sorry, yes, I do apologize, I should have put that on earlier. Back. Now I'm going to ruin everything. Oh, here we are. I know what I'm doing. Yes. The house north of the church was somewhere here. It's actually, I mean, if you really put it in, I won't go into details, but some people think it was, that the land it was built on was taken into the churchyard, but there isn't room for a large house in the churchyard, and a more rational person has argued that it's actually here. And south and west of the church is here, and here is the town bridge that was talked about by Leyland. So there's all this land here on which you could actually build 2 courtyards quite easily, no problem. Here we go, yes. Fairford Church, until sometime in the late 15th century, was cruciform with a central tower. And when it came to be rebuilt, the transepts were abolished, leaving hints of roof lines on the tower. And the tower was eventually rebuilt from the roof level upwards. Its solid internal piers and some random details survive. Judging by some rather odd footings under the east wall outside, the new building was slightly reorientated and it was given a small square-ended sanctuary. And west of that, the building runs continuously westwards, but the tower interrupts the central vessel, making a natural division between chancel and nave. There is a very handsome south porch and a small door in the north aisle at its junction with the chapel where John Tame requested burial. In other words, John Tame is buried in this bit, and then the rest of the north aisle goes off that way. As at Steeple Ashton, the structure is consistent throughout. It has very large windows at both levels, which is standard practice of the time. And otherwise, the interior is very plain. The chancel is single story, but the nave has a high clerestory, very common in that part of the world. There is little sculptured decoration, apart from narrow wall shafts above the arcade, leading to 2 tiers of angel corbels supporting the roof timbers. The piers are composite, their mouldings matching in volume the 3 orders of the arcade. Moulded capitals and bases complete the design. Now, the only people who have written anything sensible about the architecture are very briefly Hilary Waymont in his study of the glass and Anna Evis, John's beloved wife. Anna set the building in some sort of context, and she makes out a good case for construction to have begun in the 1490s. The only useful date for the building is the reference to burial in the North Chapel in John Tame's will of 1497, when we can presume that those 2 bays, at least, were in existence. Since local master masons ensured that every church was different in detail, architectural parallels are hard to come by. For the pier profile, Anna suggested a comparison with the nave of St Mary's, the University Church in Oxford, which was in building during the 1490s. And it's the same, as you can see, the same sort of tripartite design as Fairford. And I have to say, I totally agree with that. I mean, there's nothing, apart from this, remotely like Fairford anywhere nearby. The interior decoration of the tower which closely resembles that of St Sampson Cricklade just up the road. But insofar as Cricklade is dated, it's likely that Fairford is the earlier version. The exterior decoration of Fairford Tower does provide food for thought. The outside of the church in general seems rooted to the spot. pinned down by the array of crenellations and pinnacles, and relief comes in the form of figures on the string courses, carved in a lively style that contrasts markedly with the work on the tower, which is thoroughly crude and appears to be echoed at Cricklade. Now, this splendid chap, who's the most famous of all, is actually a replica. All of the figures on the string courses were recarved. They are replicas. They're good replicas, because Anna, in her article, produces the pre-restoration photographs, and done by a local mason. And he's actually here somewhere. Here he is. And so you'll see him as you go towards the church. And he is actually the jolliest of all, I have to say. Fairford was a royal manor throughout its history, and the monarchy retained ownership until the 16th century. And before the Thames, the lordship of the manor was conferred on top aristocrats. The faces of the tower reflect this, exhibiting the arms of... Oh, sorry, there are the awful figures at the bottom of the tower. Well, you might like them, actually. And the faces of the tower reflect this, exhibiting the arms of Clare, Despencer, and the Beauchamp Earls of Warwick. And they're joined by the rather dubious Tame arms and emblems of various local tradespeople. Here, the tailors and the foresters, scissors and a horn. John Lee, in his article on the brasses at Tame, has a very good analysis of the oddity of the arms of the Tame family. They were conferred, but we think, the people who've looked at it think that Edmund jumped the gun and created some arms before they were actually entitled to use them. And there seem to be two things going on here. It's generally agreed that the tower was completed by Edmund Tame, who was a colossal social climber, and that the arms of his aristocratic predecessors were put on to enhance his prestige by association, to which I would add an emphasis on the fact that this was throughout a royal manor which was only ever leased by the lords of it, if you see what I mean, and it mattered a great deal to them because it was not exactly in the middle of, but part of the enormous York family holdings in that part of the world. And it was also Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and then Henry VIII at different times, well, I mean, Henry and Elizabeth were together, but Henry VIII was different, stayed there. And it was a staging post on the way back from the west. If they were going back to London via their preferred route through Langley, which is in Wychwood, and Woodstock, and then on that way, they stopped. It was an obvious place for them to stop. And I suspect, though this is being a bit sentimental, that because it was very much in York territory, and Elizabeth's grandmother had founded a chantry in Lechlade, which is only 7 miles away, that for her it actually had quite sentimental associations. But one can't ever prove that. But I just would like to draw your attention to that. And it may not. There may be more to those coats of arms than people have said. The symbols of the tradespeople are something else. Now we're getting down to it. We can dismiss an early suggestion that they were put up by grateful citizens to the Thames for providing them with a livelihood. It's much more likely that they contributed to the cost of building and wanted their generosity to be recorded. Sally Annesley and Anna Evis and others have proposed this, but confined the tradesman's generosity to the tower. Gabriel Byng was rather more robust in his association of citizen participation. All of them are onto something, and the fabric of the church provides evidence in their support. And in the case of Anna, and I think Sally Annesley as well, they were contributing to a book which I think was very much supported by Fairford nationalists or John Tame nationalists, and nobody in that face of those people would dare to suggest that somebody else had paid for the church, and so I think they were probably both of them being tactful. But the fabric does provide evidence in their support. The building looks remarkably consistent, just as at Steeple Ashton. Here, except for the tower area, the only oddities are at the east end, where the three-aisled main building is tied in with the small sanctuary. And this is sort of more or less around where the oddities in the foundations are as well. And it may be that they began the long westward run of bays on the original footprint, and the attempts to accommodate the eastern footings required adjustments inside. Yet, consistent though the building is, there's evidence of a change of workshop. And I'm very grateful to Jenny Alexander for pointing out the difference in the level of putlog holes, which indicates, according to her, such a change. And I'm even more grateful to her for finding the evidence exactly where it needed to be. How are we doing on time? No, I won't tell you the story, not now anyway, of how she pointed it out to me. But it is actually between the bay between the North Chapel, west bay of the North Chapel, which is here, low putlog, and the bay immediately west of that, high putlog. And the minute Jenny saw that, she said, well, there's your evidence. And there aren't many surviving putlogs on the rest of the building, but such as there are all at the same higher level, except the ones on the North Chapel. So this is what I'm proposing. John Tame, Lord of the Manor since 1479, possibly spent the 1480s adding to the large house, and then built the North Chapel of the church before 1497. There's a record of 2 mysterious visitations of the church in 1491 and 1497, which are traditionally associated, well, since the 19th century, with the construction, but there's no evidence. However, it's worth remembering that 1497 was the year John Tame made his will, evidently in anticipation of his imminent death, and which didn't in the event occur until 3 years later, and perhaps the visitation concerned the chapel and its consecration. Once the chapel was up, Tame took no further interest in the architecture, as I've said, and confined his gifts to vestments, liturgical vessels, and furnishings. From then on, building the church was a collective affair, including Edmund and the tradesmen, who were, of course, most of them lesser merchants. Edmund was busy creating a Tame family myth, successfully, if Leyland's reaction to the Tames is anything to go by. And the putlogs may show that there was a pause after the chapel was finished, but that the execution shows that the original design was honoured throughout. Thus, we have 3 parish churches, or parts of them, all attributed to merchant patronage. The first, Steeple Ashton, is based on mixed evidence of a recast notice in the church and hints in wills. The second, St Thomas Salisbury, is documented. The third, Fairford, is based on a tomb, a will, and an attribution reported by Leyland. Of the 3, the first 2 are definitely collective endeavours, and I argue that the third is as well. A single merchant and his son did not build Fairford Church any more than 2 merchants built the Isles of Steeple Ashton. As we've seen, merchants were prolific builders in the interests of commerce, philanthropy, and saving their souls, but in their church buildings they expected collective endeavour. Yet that collective endeavour was collective in more ways than one, and here I come back to a final point that picks up on the question of design. St Thomas and Salisbury is an exception among the 3, showing signs of change and even of disagreement. But the elevation of Steeple Ashton is consistent up to the springing of the vault, and at Fairford the only tweaks to the interior are to do with reconciling the former building with its predecessor. The anomaly comes with the upper levels of the tower, which is clearly by a different architect. I mean, the man who, I presume it was a man who designed the body of Fairford Church, never designed that clunking tower. The tower has none of the grace, either inside or out, evident in the main building. The tower is generally believed to be Edmund's contribution, and its construction may even have followed after an interval. Even if Keith Barley is right to date the glass to 1505, and of course the dating of the glass is very controversial, the tower could even post-date the installation of the glazing. The tower is the sole feature that speaks of a change of designer, as distinct from a change of patron. Edmund had put the Tame arms in the church porch, which looks like a claim to involvement in the church proper, as well as the tower. The interior design of both Fairford and Steeple Ashton shows no sign of a change of workshop or a protracted wrangle, and at Steeple Ashton, the aisle design merges seamlessly into the upper elevation of the nave. We do not have the parish records that might have revealed exciting discussions and resolutions, but our contemporary discussion of medieval building design can be enhanced by contemplating the possibility that if the original architect did not see the building through to completion, because he was off building another one somewhere else, he left the parish with all the necessary templates and design details to allow them to finish their church according to his and their wishes. Thank you very much. You could.
So Nikki has very kindly agreed to take questions. So do we have any questions? Well, if nobody has any, I will kick off. Do you think there would have been a preference to be a sole patron, or did they actually want to work together? Or is it just they don't have enough money to work otherwise?
I think it's a question of not having enough money to work otherwise. I mean, a great aspiration to have some super building. And why should only the upper classes have really good buildings? You know? But that in the end, they were careful with their money. They were doing other things with it. They were pragmatists. Oh, yes, good word, yes. Tim, better have Tim, because after all, he featured.
Thank you. Oh, yes. Oh, I can hear now myself in my ears too. Sorry, I'm rather deaf. That was a magnificent lecture. I only did a little thing about 30-something years ago when the Royal Commission inventory thing was obviously completely wrong and made a complete pig's ear of that church. So it needs more work. Dare I say it, with your other churches, the future is, and it needs money, that's why it never happens, is the use of much more dendrochronology. Anything timber in Fairford, with the techniques that Dan Miles, particularly of the Oxford Dendro Lab, could do with tiny cores without no damage, will give you dates for the felling of the timbers. And you can then recreate that in relation to a new full, using all the modern photogrammetry techniques, the sequences of masonry. And even, dare I say it, for the house that's gone at Fairford, ground-penetrating radar, the latest, because I'm a complete skeptic of resistivity and the sort of amateur rubbish that goes on among the archaeologists in so many places, will again produce the foundations and the topography of the demolished buildings. I'm sure at Fairford, I haven't been there for a long time, but it's a wonderful place. Yeah. And that's where you can then do the topography of the church and the surrounding area. And all of that will then answer your questions, because I'm sure you're right, there's so many other people involved, and even if we don't have the traditional documentary evidence, modern archaeology, if I can call it that, but it's archaeology to people now is only people who dig little holes, I'm afraid, and it's all amateur and useless, is the future, particularly Fairford.
Yeah, well, I hope somebody can raise the money. You will all have observed that I didn't touch anything about the screens or the wall paintings or the ritual layout of Fairford, which Anna actually writes about very interestingly in her piece, because I wanted to stick very much to the stone framework. But there's a colossal amount of original woodwork in Fairford, so it could be done.
Hello, I've got a question over here. Thank you.
Oh, hi.
My question is about visibility, because you charted some really interesting examples where you think, the consequences of crowdfunding are very visible in the fabric. But I'm wondering if it always has to be so. I can quite imagine there being situations, for example, where a merchant is a sort of leading local figure and is pulling together a group of people to fund things, but that doesn't necessarily, if it's crowdfunded from the beginning, it might not necessarily be as visible as we might see from a disruption. So I was wondering what you think about that possibility and whether we could widen this frame of discussion a little further through that.
I think it really is a possibility. The problem is finding the evidence for it. Because after all, merchants spent their lives doing deals, so why shouldn't they do deals over building? I'm sure they did. But the trouble is that the evidence, as far as I know, doesn't exist. I'll give Gabriel Bing another whack and see, but it seemed to me that he was sort of committed and, you know, in parish worthies and things of this sort, but not actually smoke-filled rooms with merchants in the back of Norwich saying, well, you build the porch and I'll put in a few windows. We just haven't got that.
Yes, well, we don't have the beer mats with the kind of real deal on them, do we? But that's sort of, I think it opens up an intriguing possibility for scholars moving forward. I think we do need to be more open to being more openly speculative in how we write about buildings and admitting we don't know this. There are some possible gaps, and being more comfortable letting those possibilities be out in the open. So I found that very positive. Thank you.
Actually, sort of what I was going to ask got somewhat covered with that last question and answer, which is about how the thing worked when you go from a single patron to multiple patrons, whether that's in the course of the building or indeed, as it were, from the inception of the building. And I suppose I was wondering in a rather loaded way whether you think that that shouldn't put more of the, as it were, weight of credit back towards the masons or architects of the buildings. Because merchants in their smoke-filled, probably not by that stage, smoke-filled room, but beer-filled rooms, working out who's going to pay for what is one thing. But you're showing a lot of uniformity of design. And do we think this lies with the actual builders of the church rather than the patrons?
Well, this is actually, I think, you've hit it. Because the fact that it was the incredible uniformity of consistency of Steeple Ashton, because actually its mouldings and everything are much more complicated than Fairford, so you really see it. And you also see it because it is so fantastically beautifully built. I mean, the stone is wonderful, and it's not restoration, it's actual original stonework, and it is wonderful. And so you are very much aware of this, and that's why the point I made at the end about the master mason, if he had to go off somewhere else, left everything necessary for other masons. Well, I mean, the masons who are actually doing the building masons, actually, to go on cutting the mouldings and doing all these things and putting them all together. But that was pure speculation as well. And I don't think there is really the evidence to... I mean, the business of what happens when you leave an aisle half-built and you've died and your widow is saying, I'm not going to pay for this. I mean, does the entire village start quarrelling, or do they start getting together and saying, you know, let's see what we can do here and get the masons back. We've got all the necessary material in which we can do it. I can actually give you a very nice 19th century example of that, still waiting to be built. At Overwerton Church in Oxfordshire, they were supposed to they have a horrible stumpy tower, mid-19th century, horrible stumpy tower. But that horrible stumpy tower was meant to be topped by the most wonderful spire, for which the architect left the drawing, which is still in the church. I keep saying to them, come on, you know, build it. But it's there. And whenever anybody can raise the money or the will to do it, they could do it. Yeah. Lindy had a question. Yes, she did.
Nikki, thank you very much. That was absolutely splendid, and opens lots of questions. And I know nothing about late medieval stuff. I mean, my impression from 13th century, and mainly I know about France rather than England, is that actually it is expected that the nave will be very much a communal building project among the parishioners. And Udrigo, as usual, Archbishop of Rouen, he has trouble with the parishioners at Ophé, which is quite a nice building. And it's a priory, so the whichever abbey is in charge of the choir, but the nave has been let completely to fall down by all the members of the parish. And, you know, they're going to be quite wealthy in that area, not the great merchants that you're talking about here, but nevertheless, so he has this wonderful sort of impression of all these quite wealthy merchants, traders, just quarrelling among themselves and refusing to get on with it and letting the whole thing fall down. And I just wondered, you know, that does give the impression that that building the nave is you would think of it as as very much a sort of joint project, a crowd-funded project.
Well, you would, but bearing in mind Leyland, in 1542, when the Reformation was on, but knowledge of what had happened, even if it's just folk knowledge passed down, in Leyland's lifetime, he would have known what it was like before the Reformation. And yet he was perfectly happy to accept and report that a single patron built, not just Fairford, but I mean other churches as well, nave and all. And he clearly had no interest or memory of the fact that people wanted collectively to build. But Cirencester is a very good example of what you're saying. When finally, they weren't even allowed to put chantries in the nave of Cirencester until the 15th century. There's one then. And then, of course, there's the big one, which was done by William Prelate and his chum. But when finally, in the early 16th century, the merchants were allowed to rebuild the nave, it took that long for the merchants to be able to assert themselves over the abbey, which, of course, kept an absolute grip over everything east of the screen. It is an extraordinary story. And then, of course, they really went to town and put all their arms up and everything. So yes, I think there probably was that. But in these instances, we have no evidence. And at Steeple Ashton, that was the one that got me thinking about Isles, actually, that you really don't know if the original agreement was that the parish would take the superstructure on up, that they would be responsible for what was being built up above. I mean, one can only assume that they in fact did agree to that, and then suddenly found they got to finish the aisles as well, which is not what they were expecting to do.
Thank you, Nikki. I wondered whether you got any thoughts on or have come across any evidence for the role of the church warden in the examples that you've been talking about.
No.
Certainly for Norwich and East Anglia, there's instances where the wills of wealthy merchants are making some attempt at controlling a project, but then essentially passing it over to that person who is the church warden, and thinking about the type of person that a parish would choose to have as a church warden and the skills that role needed. And I wonder how that position plays into the collective crowdfunding model you were just talking about.
You're very lucky in East Anglia.
For all sorts of reasons.
We don't have the evidence. We have no, I mean, the evidence I gave you is all the evidence we have, which is zilch.
Thanks, Nikki. That was fascinating. I wonder if the analogy of John Leyland sort of thinking about just a name has any analogy with the sort of bishops build a cathedral, whereas we know, yeah, they may have paid for it, but the day-to-day work and all the rest of it was more than likely done by someone on the ground, and of course every now and then a prior or something might be named. But whether, because John Tame was the citizen, he was given the Leyland sort of automatically presumed that he was the chief man, and that's it.
Yes, I think that the problem, of course, is that the image of John Tame was being created by his son. That we know he was the leading. I mean, he was the joint lord of. Well, he was actually sole lord of the manor by that time because his co-lord had died. But the family, the prominence of the family, was kind of created by Edmund. You can see Edmund wanting to get, well, he was in the higher royal circles by the time, at least he managed not to go to the field of cloth of gold, but he was on the whole sort of flirting about with all that. So I mean, he was clearly the rich man, but was the same expectation made of a rich man who happens to have the largest house in the village, made as you would for a bishop? Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
That when it's the parish church, do you have the same set of standards about how you sort of rate everybody and their obligation to build the church or to inaugurate it or whatever. I don't know, but I'll give it some thought.
Sorry, I mustn't. You see, you've stimulated me. The one thing at St Thomas in Salisbury we don't know anything about is the nave.
No.
Except we do have church warden's accounts. The eastern bays were cleaned superbly, the wonderful angels and all the rest of it. The money ran out, hundreds of thousands of pounds have been spent on that, but they never did any dendro there. A sequence of dendro, which could be done not necessarily in 50 years' time when I'm long dead, which is when they think the next bit will be, we could then look at that and one could put together the documentary evidence, because I'm sure crowdfunding is I've forgotten that expression, it's too modern for me, but that's what it is. In Salisbury, the most important church, and we do have the documents, but we need to mesh them together with dates of the various phases. On the dirty aisle nave roofs, they're so dirty and covered in thick gunge now, all sorts of remarkable coats of arms. Bourchier, for example, I think, the family of the Archbishop, in the late, and that sort of thing. So you've got a huge amount. And so with money funding for dendro, at least, I think you could work up exactly the sequence and ultimately the date of the most famous thing in the church now, the Rood, which is presumably after the St Osmond is finally canonized in 1457 with his figure there, but how it relates to the whole nave. And we know there were hundreds of it. No, that's exact. Lots of lights all over the place. And the building on the north side is, of course, where 10 or 20 chantry priests lived in the house that is all part of the church. So there's a huge amount that can carry on your extremely stimulating lecture.
Thank you, Tim. But in 50 years' time, I'm not going to be around either, so...
Well, it's for the new generation.
It is. It's for the new generation, yes.
But stimulated by people like you. That's what I find is the problem. Everybody loves dendrochronology. Vernacular architecture has gone vast amount forward because of dendrochronology. Not, dare I say it, in church archaeology. Very few examples, or certainly that I know of.
If there are no further questions, let's move on to the next stage of the proceedings, but not before thanking Nikki very much for such an interesting lecture. Thank you, Nikki. Now I'd like to invite Martin to the front to lead our minute's silence. Thank you, Martin.
We have all been thinking about, meditating on, and praying for John ever since we had this devastating news. And we've done this individually. But this is the opportunity for us to have a sort of corporate act of remembrance. So I will invite you to stand for a minute. Dear John, may you rest in peace. We can now go